The wagon jolted over another rut in the dusty road, and Clara Whitmore pressed her hand against the wooden seat to steady herself, watching the rocky mountain foothills rise like giants against the Colorado sky of 1878. She could not hear the creak of the wheels or the driver's muttered curses, but she felt every vibration through her bones, and she read the tension in his shoulders well enough to know they were lost. Her new husband, Thomas Whitmore, had sent for her 3 months ago with promises written in elegant script, but when she had arrived in Denver 2 weeks past, she found only his business partner waiting with a black armband, and the news that Thomas had been killed in a mining accident before they ever met. The partner, a thin man named Garrett with eyes like a weasel, had insisted she honor the arrangement anyway and marry Thomas's younger brother, Jacob, an arrangement that had filled her with such dread she had fled the hotel before dawn with only her traveling bag, and the small inheritance her grandmother had left her sewn into the lining of her coat. The driver turned to shout something at her, his mouth moving rapidly, and Clara shook her head and pointed to her ear, then made the gesture she had learned meant death in this vast and unforgiving territory. His expression shifted from irritation to something darker, and he yanked the horses to a stop so suddenly, Clara nearly tumbled from her seat. He thrust his hand out, palm up, and she understood well enough what he wanted. She had already paid him in Denver, paid him generously to take her to the settlement of Pine Ridge where she hoped to find work as a seamstress. But she could see in his face that he thought her deafness made her easy prey. When she shook her head firmly, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise and hauled her down from the wagon seat. The world spun as Clara hit the ground, dust filling her mouth and nose. The driver threw her bag after her, and she glimpsed his mouth forming what she knew must be cruel words before he snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched away, leaving her alone on a road that stretched empty in both directions through the pine forest. She sat there for a long moment, her hands shaking as she brushed dirt from her dark blue traveling dress, the one she had worn because Thomas's letters had said blue was his favorite color. Thomas who was dead. Thomas who she would never meet. Thomas whose brother wanted to claim her like property because some papers had been signed. Clara pushed herself to her feet and picked up her bag, heavy with the few possessions she owned in this world. The sun was past its zenith, sliding toward the mountain peaks in the west, and she knew enough about survival to understand she needed shelter before nightfall. She had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the only deaf child in a hearing family who had loved her but never quite understood her, and she had learned to read situations and faces, and weather with a keenness that went beyond sound. The air smelled like coming rain, and the wind had picked up, making the pine trees sway and bend. She started walking in the direction the wagon had been headed, toward Pine Ridge, though she had no idea how many miles remained. She had walked perhaps an hour when the first drops began to fall, cold and heavy. Within minutes, it became a deluge, soaking through her wool cloak and dress, making the road a river of mud that sucked at her boots with each step. Lightning flashed across the sky, and Clara counted the seconds by heartbeat before the thunder that she could not hear, but could feel as a pressure in her chest. She was shivering violently when she spotted the cabin set back from the road, smoke rising from a stone chimney that meant warmth and possibly kindness, though she had learned not to count on the latter. The cabin was larger than she expected, built of solid logs with a covered porch and a barn behind it. Clara hesitated at the edge of the clearing, propriety warring with necessity, but another flash of lightning decided her. She hurried to the porch and knocked on the heavy wooden door, then knocked again harder when no one came. She was raising her fist for a third attempt when the door swung open, and she found herself staring up at the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway, his chest broad and muscular beneath a worn flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms roped with strength. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was all hard angles and sharp planes, weathered by sun and wind and time. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense as they swept over her in obvious assessment. His mouth moved, forming words she could not hear, and his expression darkened when she did not respond. Clara touched her ear and shook her head, tried to form the words "I am deaf," though she knew her voice sounded strange to hearing people, flat and uncertain. The man's eyes narrowed, and his mouth moved again, more emphatically this time. She could read anger in every line of his body, in the way he gripped the door frame hard enough that his knuckles went white. She took a step back, ready to flee back into the storm, but he reached out with one massive hand and caught her wrist. His touch was surprisingly gentle despite his obvious fury, and he pulled her into the cabin and shut the door against the rain. The interior was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table and chairs, a bed in one corner and shelves lined with supplies. He released her wrist and pointed at her, then at his eyes, then at his mouth, and Clara understood he wanted her to watch him. His lips moved slowly and clearly as he said something, and she caught the words mountain and alone and what might have been husband. She shook her head quickly and set down her bag, then pulled out the small slate and chalk she carried for communication. She wrote in careful letters, "I am Clara Whitmore, deaf. Driver left me, going to Pine Ridge." She held it up for him to read, watching his face for reaction. His expression remained hard, but he took the slate from her hands and wrote beneath her words in surprisingly neat handwriting, "Jonas Blackwood. Pine Ridge is 15 miles. Storm bad. Stay tonight." Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully she felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of this stern mountain man who looked at her like she was a problem he had not asked for. She nodded and wrote on the slate, "Thank you. I can pay." Jonas's expression darkened further, and he wrote with enough force that the chalk snapped, "No money. Supper soon." He pointed at a chair by the fire, clearly ordering her to sit, then turned away and went to the fireplace where a pot hung over the flames. Clara sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how her feet ached and her dress clung cold and wet to her skin. She watched Jonas move around the cabin with an economy of motion that spoke of a man comfortable in his solitude. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a few years older, and he wore his isolation like armor. He ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls and brought them to the table, then gestured impatiently for her to join him. The stew was venison and vegetables, rich and hot, and Clara ate ravenously while Jonas watched her with those storm-cloud eyes. When she finished, he took her bowl and refilled it without asking, and she saw something shift in his expression, something almost gentle before the hardness returned. After supper, he brought her a blanket and pointed at the bed, but Clara shook her head firmly and pointed at the floor near the fire. She would not take his bed. They argued silently, passing the slate back and forth with increasingly emphatic words, until finally, Jonas threw up his hands in obvious frustration and stalked outside, returning minutes later with an armload of furs that he spread near the hearth to make a second sleeping place. Clara changed into her nightdress behind a screen in the corner, hanging her wet things to dry, and when she emerged, Jonas was already in his bed with his back to the room, one arm thrown over his eyes. She lay down on the furs and pulled the blanket around herself, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls. She thought about Thomas Whitmore lying dead in a mine somewhere, about Jacob Whitmore wanting to marry her sight unseen, about the driver who had abandoned her, and the uncertain future that waited in Pine Ridge. But mostly she thought about Jonas Blackwood, and the way he had been angry at her presence yet fed her anyway, given her shelter anyway, made sure she was warm anyway. She fell asleep wondering what kind of man lived alone on a mountain, and why such anger lived behind his eyes. She woke to pale gray light filtering through the windows and the smell of coffee and bacon. Jonas was at the fireplace cooking breakfast, already dressed in canvas work pants and a clean shirt, his hair still wet as though he had washed at the pump outside. He glanced over when she sat up, and his expression was no softer than it had been the night before. Clara rose and folded the furs neatly, then dressed quickly behind the screen and joined him at the table. He set a plate before her piled with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread fried in butter, and they ate in silence broken only by the scrape of utensils on wood. When they finished, Jonas wrote on the slate, "Dress warm. I take you to town." Clara felt a pang of disappointment she had no right to feel. Of course he wanted her gone. She was an intrusion on his solitary life, a complication he had not asked for. She wrote back, "Thank you for kindness," but he just grunted and turned away to gather supplies. An hour later she was sitting on the seat of his wagon, her bag at her feet, while Jonas guided two sturdy horses down the mountain road. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright, the aspens shimmering gold among the evergreens and the sky so blue it hurt to look at. They had traveled perhaps 5 miles when they rounded a bend, and Jonas hauled the horses to a sharp stop. A tree had fallen across the road, too large to move and too wide to go around, where the slope dropped steeply on one side and rose sharply on the other. Jonas's mouth moved in what Clara suspected were curses, and he jumped down to inspect the obstacle. She climbed down as well, studying the tree and the terrain. The bark was splintered and pale, the fall recent, probably from the storm. Jonas was already unhitching the horses when Clara touched his arm to get his attention, and pointed up the slope, where she could see what looked like an old game trail winding through the trees parallel to the road. Jonas followed her gaze and shook his head, wrote on the slate he had thought to bring, "Too steep for wagon." Clara took the chalk and wrote, "Walk. How far to town?" Jonas hesitated, calculating, then wrote, 10 miles, rough going." Clara straightened her shoulders and wrote, "I am strong." Something flickered across Jonas's face, something that might have been respect, and he nodded once. He unhitched the horses completely and led them back along the road to a small meadow where he hobbled them to graze, then returned and shouldered both her bag and a pack of his own supplies. Clara started to protest, but he gave her such a fierce look that she closed her mouth and followed him up the slope. The trail was narrow and treacherous, thick with roots and loose stones. Clara's skirts caught on branches, and her boots slipped on wet leaves, but she kept pace with Jonas's long strides through sheer determination. He glanced back at her frequently, his expression unreadable, and once when she stumbled he caught her elbow to steady her, his hand warm and solid even through her sleeve. They walked for hours, climbing higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and cold. Clara's legs burned and her lungs ached, but she would not complain, would not give Jonas Blackwood reason to think her weak. They stopped to rest beside a stream where water tumbled over smooth rocks in cascades of white foam. Jonas pulled bread and cheese from his pack and shared it with Clara, and they ate sitting on sun-warmed boulders while birds she could not hear wheeled overhead. Jonas was watching her with a strange intensity, and finally he reached for the slate and wrote, "Why you alone? Where is family?" Clara felt the familiar ache of old loneliness and wrote back, "Dead. All dead. Fever 3 years ago." It was not entirely true. Her parents had died of fever, but her older brother had simply left one day and never written, had not wanted the burden of a deaf sister. But Jonas did not need to know that. Jonas's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he wrote, "Sorry." Then after a pause, "Husband," Clara's hand trembled as she wrote the truth she had told no one else. "Never met him. He died before I arrived. His brother wanted to marry me instead. I ran away." Jonas's jaw tightened and he wrote with barely controlled fury, "Brother forced you." Clara nodded and wrote, "Thought he owned me because of papers Thomas signed." Jonas stood abruptly and Clara feared she had angered him, but he wrote quickly, "Good you ran. Man like that is no man. You stay in Pine Ridge, safe there." They continued walking through the afternoon, and Clara found herself studying Jonas when he walked ahead of her on the narrow trail. His body moved with the fluid grace of a predator, muscles shifting beneath his shirt, and she could see the strength in every line of him. He was built for this harsh land, built for survival, and yet he had shown her kindness when he could have turned her away. She wondered what had driven him to live alone on this mountain, wondered what sorrows lived behind his anger, and found herself wanting to know him in a way that was both dangerous and foolish. The sun was sinking toward the peaks when Jonas stopped suddenly and held up a hand. Clara moved to stand beside him and saw 3 men on the trail ahead, rough-looking men with guns on their hips and predatory eyes. The tallest one said something and Jonas responded, his body tense and ready. Clara could not hear the exchange, but she could read the threat in every line of the strangers, in the way they looked at her with hungry eyes and cruel smiles. The tall man stepped closer and said something else, gesturing at Clara, and Jonas moved to place himself between them, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. Everything happened very fast then. The tall man reached for Clara and Jonas hit him with a fist like a hammer, dropping him to the ground. The other 2 men rushed forward, and Jonas fought them both with brutal efficiency, his movements economical and devastating. Clara wanted to help but knew she would only be in the way, so she picked up a fallen branch and held it ready, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonas dispatched the second man with an elbow to the face and threw the third bodily off the trail to tumble down the slope. The tall man was staggering to his feet when Jonas grabbed him by his shirt front and said something directly into his face, something that made the man go pale and nod frantically. Jonas released him, and the 3 men stumbled away back down the trail, one of them leaving a thin trail of blood from his broken nose. Jonas stood breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding, and when he turned to Clara, his expression was fierce and protective, and something else she could not name. He reached for the slate and wrote, "You hurt." Clara shook her head and without thinking took his hand to examine his knuckles. The skin was torn and already swelling, and she pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and wrapped it around his hand, tying it carefully. Jonas watched her with those storm cloud eyes, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks under his gaze. They reached Pine Ridge just as full darkness fell, lantern light glowing golden in windows and the sound of a piano, which Clara could not hear but Jonas clearly could, drifting from a saloon. The town was larger than Clara expected, a main street lined with shops and businesses, houses spreading up the hillsides, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking and horses. Jonas led her to a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Henderson, a plump grandmother with kind eyes and silver hair. Jonas spoke with her while Clara waited, and she saw money change hands before Jonas wrote on the slate, "Paid for 2 weeks." Mrs. Henderson knows good seamstress retired. You can buy her business maybe." Clara stared at the words, then at Jonas, emotion thick in her throat. She wrote, "Too much. Cannot accept," but Jonas was already turning away. She caught his arm and he stopped, looking down at where her small hand rested on his muscular forearm. She wrote one-handed awkwardly, "Why help me?" Jonas took the slate and stared at it for a long moment before writing, "Because you needed help." Then he handed her the slate and walked out into the night before Clara could respond. Mrs. Henderson showed Clara to a small clean room with a real bed and a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. The older woman's lips moved in what Clara assumed were explanations and instructions, and Clara did her best to follow along, nodding when it seemed appropriate. When Mrs. Henderson left, Clara sank onto the bed and pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the events of the past 2 days. She thought about Jonas Blackwood walking back alone to his cabin on the mountain, and she felt his absence like a physical ache. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson brought Clara to meet Edith Palmer, the retired seamstress, a tiny woman of perhaps 70 with fingers gnarled by arthritis and a sharp, intelligent gaze. Edith studied Clara for a long moment, then pulled out a piece of paper and wrote, "Show me what you can do." She provided fabric and thread, and Clara's hands flew, creating neat seams and tiny, careful stitches, embroidering a small flower with skill born of years of practice. Sewing had been her solace growing up, the one thing she could do as well as anyone else, the one place where her deafness did not matter. Edith watched with approval and wrote, "Very good. Shop is yours for $40. Includes sewing machine, fabrics, patterns, everything." It was more than fair, likely less than the business was worth, and Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she counted out the money from her inheritance. Edith patted her hand and wrote, "I remember what it is to be young and alone. You will do well here." The shop was on Main Street between the general store and the barber shop. A single room with large windows that let in good light and shelves of fabric in every color. Clara spent the rest of the day taking inventory and cleaning, and when she hung her sign in the window that read "Seamstress Clara Whitmore," she felt pride swell in her chest. That night, she lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind returning again and again to Jonas. She had not even thanked him properly. He had paid for her lodging and helped her find the shop and probably saved her life on that trail, and she had let him walk away without saying all the things she needed to say. She thought about his fierce protectiveness when those men threatened her, about the way he had made sure she was warm and fed even though her presence angered him, about his hands wrapping her furs around her shoulders with unexpected gentleness. Over the following days, Clara established herself in Pine Ridge. The townspeople were curious about the deaf seamstress, but most were kind, and those who were not were quickly corrected by Mrs. Henderson, who seemed to have adopted Clara as a project. Work came steadily, hems to take up and shirts to mend and Sunday dresses to let out for growing children. Clara discovered that Mrs. Henderson was teaching herself to sign, learning from a book she had ordered from Denver, and Clara felt her heart warm at the effort. She made friends with Alice Morrison, who ran the general store, a young woman near Clara's own age of 22 who was cheerful and talkative, and did not seem to mind that Clara could not hear her stories. 3 weeks passed, and Clara found herself watching the road that led to the mountains, hoping to see a tall figure on a wagon, knowing it was foolish. Jonas had delivered her safely and fulfilled his obligation. He had no reason to return. But still she looked, and still she felt disappointment settle heavy in her stomach each evening when he did not appear. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, when autumn was painting the aspens gold and orange, the shop door opened and Jonas Blackwood filled the doorway. Clara's hands froze on the dress she was hemming, her heart suddenly pounding hard enough that she wondered if it showed through her shirtwaist. Jonas looked uncomfortable in the civilized setting of the shop, too large and rough and wild, but his eyes found hers immediately and something passed between them that made Clara's breath catch. He approached the counter and pulled out a slate, their slate, the one they had used on the mountain. He wrote, "Need shirt, 2 shirts, work shirts." Clara managed to nod and reached for her measuring tape with shaking hands. Jonas stood very still while she measured his shoulders, so broad her tape barely reached his chest, his arms thick with muscle. She could feel the heat of his body and smell pine and leather and wood smoke. And when she accidentally met his eyes, she saw something there that made her cheeks flush hot. She wrote measurements in her order book and showed him fabric choices, and he pointed to a sturdy dark blue cotton that would wear well. Clara wrote on the slate, 1 week, and Jonas nodded, but he made no move to leave. Finally, he took the slate and wrote, "You are well, safe here." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest and wrote back, "Yes, thank you for everything." Jonas's expression softened slightly and he wrote, "Shop is good, you did good." It was such simple praise, but it meant more than he could know. They stood there in the afternoon light, the slate passing between them, and Clara wrote before she could stop herself, "I thought about you." Jonas's eyes widened slightly and his jaw tightened. He stared at the words for a long time before he wrote, "Thought about you too." Then he set the slate down carefully and turned and walked out of the shop before Clara could respond, the bell above the door jingling his departure. Clara pressed her hands to her hot cheeks and allowed herself a small smile. He had thought about her. He had come to town. He had ordered shirts he probably did not need. She worked on his shirts every evening that week, putting extra care into every stitch, embroidering a small pine tree inside the collar where no one would see it, but he would know it was there. When the week passed and he did not return, she felt worry gnaw at her. Was he unwell? Had something happened? She asked Alice Morrison if anyone knew Jonas Blackwood, and Alice's eyes went wide. "The hermit up on Blackwood Peak. Clara, he never comes to town. Hasn't been down in near 2 years before he brought you in. Lives all alone up there and has a temper like thunder, or so people say. Though he fought in the war, I hear, was a captain or some such, and they say something terrible happened that drove him to the mountains." Clara felt her heart ache for whatever pain had sent Jonas into isolation. That evening, Mrs. Henderson came to Clara's room with coffee and concern written on her face. She had her slate ready and wrote, "Alice says you asked about Jonas Blackwood. He is a good man, but a hard man. Do not hope for softness there." Clara wrote back, "He was kind to me," and Mrs. Henderson's expression turned thoughtful. She wrote, "Maybe you see something others do not, or maybe you bring out something in him that has been buried. Be careful, child. Mountain men do not make easy husbands." The word husband made Clara's pulse race. She had not let herself think that far, had not let herself imagine a future beyond grateful friendship, but now the idea took root in her mind and grew. She imagined Jonas's cabin warm with curtains and rugs, imagined cooking supper in his hearth and sleeping beside him in that big bed, imagined his hands gentle on her skin and his arms strong around her. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they persisted, sweet and impossible. Another week passed, and Clara had resigned herself to Jonas not returning when she looked up from her sewing one afternoon to see him standing in her doorway again. Her face broke into a smile before she could stop it, and she saw his expression soften in response. He approached the counter and she produced his shirts, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Jonas unwrapped them slowly and examined her work, and she saw approval in his eyes. He pulled out money, but Clara shook her head and wrote on the slate, payment for saving my life." Jonas's jaw tightened and he wrote, "Cannot take free, not right." Clara wrote back, "Gift then, from friend." She saw him struggle with this, saw pride war with something else, and finally he nodded once. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with a pattern of pine trees and mountains. He set it on the counter and wrote, "For you." Clara opened the box with trembling fingers and found it lined with velvet, clearly meant to hold treasures. The carving was beautiful and intricate, the work of many hours, and Clara looked up at Jonas with wonder. She wrote, "You made this?" And he nodded, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Clara traced the carved trees with one finger and wrote, "Most beautiful thing I ever owned. Thank you." Jonas watched her with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm, and then he wrote, "Have supper with me. Hotel has dining room." It was not really a question, but Clara nodded eagerly anyway. Jonas offered his arm with awkward formality, and Clara took it, her hand small against his muscled forearm. And they walked together to the hotel, where Jonas secured a table by the window. The meal was roast chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, and Clara found herself laughing as Jonas wrote increasingly silly things on the slate to entertain her. He told her about a raccoon that kept stealing eggs from his chickens, about the massive elk he had seen that morning with antlers as wide as a man was tall, about the first snow that would come soon to the high peaks. Clara told him about her customers, about the banker's wife who wanted a ball gown though there was nowhere in Pine Ridge to wear it, about the little boy who had watched her so with such fascination she had given him scraps of fabric to practice with. When the meal ended, Jonas walked Clara back to the boarding house, and they stood on the porch in the evening light, neither wanting to part. Finally, Jonas wrote, "Can I call on you again?" And Clara felt joy bubble up in her chest. She wrote, "Please, yes," and Jonas smiled, a real smile that transformed his hard face into something beautiful. He touched her cheek with one calloused finger, the gesture so gentle it made Clara's eyes sting with tears, and then he turned and walked away into the dusk. Over the following weeks, Jonas came to town every Tuesday and Friday without fail. He brought Clara gifts each time, things he had made or found, a basket woven from willow branches, a smooth stone from the stream, a perfect pine cone. They took meals together and walked the streets of Pine Ridge, and slowly Clara learned his story through words written on the slate. He had been a captain in the Union Army during the war that had ended 13 years ago, had led men into battle and watched too many of them die. The final battle had been the worst, an ambush that killed all but 3 of his company, and Jonas had carried the guilt of it into the mountains where he tried to forget. He had a sister back in Ohio, he wrote, who sent him letters he rarely answered. He trapped furs in winter and panned gold in summer, made enough to live simply and wanted nothing more. Or he had wanted nothing more, he wrote carefully, until he found a stubborn deaf woman on his doorstep in a storm. Clara felt her heart swell at these words, and she wrote back, "I am glad I knocked on your door." Jonas took her hand across the table and squeezed it, his hand engulfing hers, and Clara felt the calluses on his palm and the warmth of his skin and wanted to never let go. The town began to talk, of course. The hermit of Blackwood Peak courting the deaf seamstress. It was too good not to gossip about. But the talk was mostly kind, people pleased to see Jonas among them again and happy that Clara had found someone to protect her. Mrs. Henderson approved. Alice Morrison declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. And even the preacher stopped Jonas on the street to tell him Clara was welcome at Sunday services if she wished to come, that God heard prayers from hearts not ears. It was on a cold October evening when Jonas arrived at the boarding house with snowflakes caught in his dark hair, and an expression of fierce determination on his face. He took Clara's hand and led her to the parlor where Mrs. Henderson was knitting by the fire, and the older woman took one look at Jonas's face and excused herself with a knowing smile. Jonas sat Clara down on the horsehair sofa and knelt before her, and Clara's heart began to race. He pulled out the slate with shaking hands and wrote, "I am not good with words. I am hard and angry and broken. But you make me want to be better. You make me want to come down from the mountain. I think about you every moment. Will you marry me?" Clara read the words once, twice, 3 times, tears streaming down her cheeks. She took the chalk and wrote, "Yes, yes, yes," and Jonas pulled her into his arms with a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. Clara buried her face in his chest and felt his heart pounding against her cheek, felt his arms strong and safe around her, and knew she was home. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on the hill, with half the town in attendance and Mrs. Henderson crying openly. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself of cream-colored silk that Alice had insisted she take as a wedding gift, and Jonas wore a new black suit that made his broad shoulders look even broader and his storm-cloud eyes even more striking. The preacher signed the vows while speaking them so Clara could follow, and when Jonas kissed her to seal their marriage, Clara felt the rightness of it down to her bones. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, and Clara watched Jonas interact with the townspeople with a patience that seemed to surprise even him. He accepted handshakes and congratulations with awkward grace, and when old Edith Palmer told him he had better take good care of her girl, Jonas wrote on the slate, "Will protect her with my life," and Edith nodded with satisfaction. Alice Morrison had organized a collection to buy them household goods, and Clara was overwhelmed by the generosity of these people who had been strangers just 2 months ago. As evening fell, Jonas helped Clara into his wagon, now loaded with her possessions and wedding gifts, and drove up the mountain road toward his cabin that was now their cabin. Snow was falling steadily, covering the world in white silence, and Clara sat close to Jonas on the wagon seat, his warmth solid against her side. When they reached the cabin, Jonas lifted Clara down from the wagon, and then, before she could protest, swept her up into his arms and carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded. He set her down gently inside and lit the lamps, and Clara saw that he had been busy preparing for her arrival. The cabin had been thoroughly cleaned, and new curtains hung at the windows, blue to match her eyes, Jonas wrote when she asked. There were shelves he had built for her things, and a rag rug by the hearth and wildflowers in a jar on the table even though it was October, and he must have searched hard to find them. Clara turned to Jonas with tears in her eyes, and he crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her close, tilting her face up to kiss her with a tenderness that stole her breath. Their wedding night was everything Clara had hoped and nothing she could have imagined. Jonas's strength tempered with gentleness as he helped her from her dress and laid her on furs before the fire. He touched her like she was precious, like she might break, until Clara pulled him down to her with a boldness that made his eyes darken with desire. They learned each other's bodies in the firelight, and if Clara could not hear the sounds of their lovemaking, she could feel every tremor and gasp in the vibration of Jonas's chest against hers, in the way his hands shook when they traced her skin, in the fierce joy on his face when they moved together as one. Afterward they lay tangled together under blankets, Jonas's arms wrapped around Clara from behind, his face buried in her hair. She felt him tremble and realized he was crying silent tears for the loneliness he had carried for so long, and the unexpected grace of love found when he had given up hoping. Clara turned in his arms and kissed away his tears, and Jonas held her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The winter that followed was the happiest of Clara's life. She woke each morning in Jonas's arms and watched the sun paint the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. Jonas taught her to snowshoe through the forest and to identify animal tracks, and Clara taught him more sign language from the books Mrs. Henderson loaned them. They developed their own language too, a combination of signs and gestures and expressions that let them communicate with increasing ease. Jonas proved to be talkative when he did not have to speak aloud, his hands flying as he told her stories about his childhood and the war and the years alone on the mountain. Clara transformed the cabin into a home with curtains and quilts and small touches of beauty wherever she could add them. She cooked meals in the big fireplace, and Jonas declared her venison stew the best he had ever tasted, though Clara suspected he would have said that if she had served him boot leather. In the evenings they sat by the fire, Jonas carving wood while Clara sewed, and the silence between them was comfortable and full of love, but the isolation weighed on Clara more than she had expected. She missed her shop and her customers, and the connection to other women that life in town had provided. She could see that Jonas was happier on his mountain, that the crowds and noise of Pine Ridge drained something from him, but she also knew she could not live so separate from the world forever. One evening in January she brought up the subject carefully, writing on their slate, "I miss the shop, miss sewing for others. Can we find balance?" Jonas read her words and was quiet for a long time, his expression troubled. Finally he wrote, "Thought you were happy here," and Clara could see hurt in his eyes. She took his hand and wrote, "I am happy with you, so happy, but I need more than just us, need purpose beyond this cabin." Jonas struggled with this. She could see the war happening behind his storm-cloud eyes, and finally he wrote, "What do you need?" Clara wrote, "Go to town 1 week each month, stay with Mrs. Henderson. Take orders, deliver finished pieces. You come when you can." Jonas did not like it, that was clear, but he nodded slowly and wrote, "If that is what you need, we find a way." Clara threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly, and Jonas pulled her into his lap and kissed her until they both forgot everything else. That night in their bed, Jonas made love to her with desperate intensity, and Clara understood he was afraid of losing her to the town, afraid she would decide mountain life was not enough. She held his face between her hands and made him look at her, and she mouthed carefully, "I love you. Only you. Forever." And she saw the fear ease in his eyes. They established a pattern after that. The first week of each month Clara went to town and stayed in her old room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She took orders at the shop, which Alice had been minding in her absence, and worked long hours to complete as much as she could. Jonas came to town 3 or 4 times during that week, awkward and uncomfortable but present, and they took meals together and walked out in the evenings. The other 3 weeks they spent on the mountain together, and Clara did her sewing in the cabin while Jonas tended his trap lines and chopped wood and did the 100 other tasks required for mountain living. Spring came late to the high country, the snow lingering until May, but when it finally melted the world exploded into color and life. Clara planted a garden beside the cabin, vegetables and herbs and flowers, and Jonas built her a fence to keep the deer away. They explored the mountain together, Jonas showing Clara secret places he had found in his years alone, a waterfall hidden in a canyon, a meadow full of columbines, a hot spring where they bathed naked under the stars and made love on sun-warmed rocks. In July, Clara realized her courses had not come and hope fluttered in her chest like a bird. She waited another month to be sure before telling Jonas, and when she finally wrote on the slate, "I think I am pregnant," Jonas's face went through such a range of emotions that Clara almost laughed. Fear, joy, terror, wonder and finally fierce protectiveness as he pulled her into his arms and held her like she might disappear. From that day forward, Jonas treated Clara like she was made of glass. He would not let her lift anything heavy or chop vegetables or reach for items on high shelves. He brought her breakfast in bed and rubbed her feet when they swelled and read aloud from books, even though she could not hear him, because someone had told him babies could hear in the womb, and he wanted their child to know his voice. Clara was touched and exasperated by turns, but mostly she was overwhelmed by how deeply Jonas loved her, how completely he had given her his battered heart. They went to town in September so the doctor could examine Clara, and he declared her healthy and the baby strong. Jonas looked like he might faint with relief, and later that night in the boarding house, he knelt beside the bed and laid his head against Clara's rounded belly with such tenderness, she felt tears slide down her cheeks. She ran her fingers through his long hair and felt their baby kick against his cheek, and Jonas looked up at her with wonder written across his face. The baby came in late January of 1880, during a blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Mrs. Henderson had come to stay with them at Jonas's insistence, and Clara was grateful for the experienced woman's presence when the pains began. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Clara was frightened, but Jonas never left her side, his strong hands holding hers, his eyes full of encouragement and love. When the baby finally arrived, a boy with a shock of dark hair and powerful lungs, Jonas wept openly as he cut the cord and wrapped his son in soft blankets. They named him Thomas, for the man whose death had set Clara on the path to Jonas, and Samuel for Jonas's father who had died when Jonas was young. Thomas Samuel Blackwood had his father's storm-cloud eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, and from his first day he owned his parents completely. Jonas was terrified of the tiny baby, his huge hands so careful as he learned to change diapers and rock Thomas to sleep. Clara watched her fierce mountain man sing silent songs to their son, watched him pace the cabin floor at night so Clara could rest, watched him look at Thomas with such love it made her heart ache. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the cabin. Clara's trips to town became less frequent as Thomas was too small to travel in harsh weather, and she found she did not mind as much as she thought she would. Her purpose now was caring for her son and her husband, and she discovered a deep satisfaction in it. Jonas built a cradle that rocked beside their bed and a high chair for when Thomas was older, and he carved toys from wood, horses and bears and birds. The war inside Jonas seemed to ease with fatherhood. He smiled more readily, and the anger that had lived behind his eyes faded to something gentler. He told Clara once, writing on the slate while Thomas nursed at her breast, "Thought I was dead inside. You and Thomas brought me back to life." Clara reached for his hand and squeezed it, unable to write with Thomas in her arms, but Jonas understood. He always understood her. When Thomas was 6 months old and the weather warm, they took him to town for the first time. The response was overwhelming. Every woman in Pine Ridge wanting to hold the baby and exclaim over his beauty. Jonas stood close to Clara's side, protective of his family, but even he seemed pleased by the attention. Mrs. Henderson declared Thomas the finest baby she had ever seen, and Alice Morrison announced she wanted 6 just like him, which made her husband blanch and everyone else laugh. That evening they attended a town social, something Jonas would never have considered before Thomas. Clara wore a new dress of rose-colored cotton and Jonas wore his wedding suit, and Thomas was passed from person to person like a treasure. The preacher blessed the baby formally and welcomed the Blackwood family into the community, and Clara saw Jonas's throat work as he fought emotion. This acceptance, this belonging, was something Jonas had not known since before the war, and Clara was grateful the town had opened its arms to her fierce, solitary husband. They stayed in town a week that visit, and Clara took orders at the shop while Jonas minded Thomas, and the sight of that massive man carrying a baby made more than one person stop and stare. Jonas seemed not to notice or care, completely focused on his son, and Clara fell in love with him all over again watching him be a father. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's strength and his mother's determination, and Jonas taught his son the mountain the way Jonas's father had once taught him. Clara returned to her sewing business in a limited way, taking only special orders she could work on at home, and supplemented their income while Jonas's trapping and mining kept them comfortable. They were not wealthy, but they had everything they needed. When Thomas was 3 years old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again, and this time Jonas was excited rather than terrified. He had learned how to be a father and was ready to do it again. The second baby came easier than the first, a girl they named Rose Margaret, and she had Clara's blonde hair and Jonas's storm cloud eyes, and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met. Jonas was impossibly gentle with his tiny daughter, and Clara often found him simply holding Rose and staring at her in wonder. Thomas adored his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, following her around as she learned to crawl and then walk, making sure she did not get into trouble. Jonas looked at his children playing together and told Clara, "Never thought I would have this. Family. Love. Never thought I deserved it." Clara took his face in her hands and made him look at her, and she said carefully, shaping the words with her lips, "You deserve everything good." And Jonas kissed her like she was air and he was drowning. They were not without challenges. The mountain winters were harsh and isolating, and there were years when money was tight and Jonas had to range far for game. There was the summer Thomas broke his arm falling from a tree, and they had to ride through a thunderstorm to reach the doctor in town. There was the winter Rose had a fever that lasted 3 days, and Clara and Jonas took turns holding her, praying to a God they hoped was listening. But through it all they had each other, and that was enough. Clara never regretted the choice to marry Jonas, to make a life on this mountain far from civilization. She had found something here she had never known in her deaf, silent childhood. She had found a place where she belonged, where her silence was understood and accepted and even valued. And Jonas had found healing in Clara's love, had found a reason to rejoin the world he had fled. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jonas surprised Clara by baking her a cake. She had taught him to bake bread years ago, but this was something different. A beautiful sweet cake with wild strawberry jam between the layers and honey frosting on top. Clara stared at it in amazement, and Jonas wrote on the slate, which they still used though both were fluent in sign language now, "Wanted to give you something sweet, because you made my bitter life sweet." Clara tasted the cake, and it was delicious, and she kissed Jonas with sugar still on her lips and thought about that first night when he had growled at her on his doorstep, angry at the intrusion, never knowing she would become his whole world. The memory made her laugh, and Jonas raised an eyebrow in question. Clara signed, "Remember when we met, you were so angry I was there." Jonas smiled and signed back, "Was angry at myself. You were so beautiful and I was so broken, did not want you to see how broken." Clara signed, "I saw you. All of you. Loved all of you." Jonas pulled her close and held her, his chin resting on top of her head, and Clara felt his heart beat steady and strong against her ear. That night after the children were asleep, Jonas made love to Clara with the tenderness of long intimacy, their bodies knowing each other so well that words were unnecessary. Afterward, Clara lay in his arms and thought about the journey that had brought her here, about Thomas Whitmore who died before she met him, about the driver who abandoned her, about the storm that led her to Jonas's door. She thought about how sometimes terrible things had to happen to lead you to exactly where you were meant to be. When Thomas was 8 and Rose was 5, Jonas made a decision that surprised Clara. He announced he wanted to build a bigger cabin closer to town, somewhere they could live year-round and still be connected to the community. Clara was shocked because she knew how much Jonas loved his mountain solitude, but he signed, "It's not about me anymore. Children need school, need friends. You need your shop. I can adjust." Clara knew what this cost him and loved him even more for it. They found land on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, close enough to walk to town but far enough to have space and privacy. Jonas built a beautiful cabin with a separate room for Clara's sewing and loft bedrooms for the children, and a wide front porch that looked toward the mountains. They moved in the spring of 1885, and Clara opened her shop full-time while Jonas found work as a hunting guide and occasional deputy when the sheriff needed help. Jonas struggled with town life more than he admitted. Clara could see it in the tension he carried in his shoulders, in the way he escaped to the mountains every chance he got. But he never complained because he saw Thomas thriving in school and Rose making friends with every child she met, and Clara's happiness as her business grew. He made the sacrifice gladly because that was what love meant to Jonas, protecting and providing for his family even when it was hard. But Clara saw and understood, and one evening she approached Jonas where he sat on the porch watching the sunset. She signed, "We need to talk about the mountain." Jonas looked surprised and signed back, "What about it?" Clara settled beside him and took his hand and signed, "You are not happy in town. I see it. We need to find better balance." They worked out a new arrangement. Every summer they would spend a month at the old cabin on Blackwood Peak, just the family, living the way they had when Thomas was small. Jonas's face when Clara suggested this was worth every compromise, and that first summer when they returned to the mountain cabin, Jonas seemed to shed years of stress. He taught Thomas to trap and fish and track, and he took Rose on long walks to show her the hidden places he had once shown Clara. Clara sewed in the doorway and watched her family and felt contentment settle into her bones. The years continued to pass, as years do, bringing changes and challenges and blessings. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet intensity and protective instincts. Rose became a beauty who collected admirers but gave her heart to the new schoolteacher, a gentle man who learned sign language to court her properly. Jonas and Clara watched their children grow and felt the bittersweet joy of parents everywhere. On Clara's 40th birthday, when Thomas was 17 and Rose was 14, Jonas surprised her with a gift. He led her to the barn behind their cabin and showed her a beautiful carved wooden sign that read, "Whitmore Fine Sewing Established 1878. Clara looked at Jonas in confusion and he signed, "You gave up your name when you married me. Want everyone to know you were Clara Whitmore first, your own woman with your own business. You became Clara Blackwood by choice, not because some man owned you." Clara felt tears stream down her face as she understood what Jonas was telling her. He had never forgotten that she came to him running from a man who thought he owned her. And Jonas wanted her to know that their marriage was different, that she was his partner and equal, that she had never lost herself in becoming his wife. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard, and Jonas held her close and signed against her back, "Love you. Always." They hung the sign above her shop the next day, and Clara felt pride every time she saw it. Jonas had given her so much over the years, security and love and family, but this recognition of her independence, her identity beyond wife and mother, This might have been the greatest gift of all. When Thomas was 19, he announced he wanted to be a hunting guide like his father, and Jonas took him on as a partner. They ranged far into the mountains together, father and son, and came back with stories of bears and elk and the harsh, beautiful wildness that was their heritage. When Rose married her schoolteacher at 20, Clara sewed her a wedding dress of white silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Jonas walked his daughter down the aisle with tears streaming into his beard. The years brought grandchildren eventually. First, Thomas married a rancher's daughter and they had 2 boys. Then Rose and her husband had a girl, and then twin boys. Jonas and Clara's cabin filled with the chaos of grandchildren on holidays and weekends. And Jonas proved to be an indulgent grandfather who let the children climb on him like he was a mountain, and carved them toys, and told them stories in sign language that Clara interpreted. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jonas and Clara returned to the old cabin on Blackwood Peak, just the 2 of them, leaving the grandchildren with their parents. They sat on the porch in the evening and watched the stars come out, and Jonas signed, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Living so different from what you planned." Clara turned to face him fully so he could see her signs clearly in the lamplight. She signed, "I planned nothing. I was running scared when I found you. You gave me everything: home, love, family, purpose. My only regret is that Thomas Whitmore died before I could thank him for sending me to you." Jonas pulled her into his arms, and Clara rested her head on his chest, still broad and strong though his hair was now threaded with silver. She thought about that stormy night 25 years ago when she knocked on this door, thought about the fierce, angry man who had answered, and how little she had known that her life was about to begin. She thought about all the moments between then and now, the joys and sorrows and daily ordinary magic of a life built together. "I love you," Jonas signed against her back, and Clara signed it back, the gesture as familiar as breathing after all these years. They sat together as darkness fell over the mountains, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from broken pieces. The old cabin looked much the same as it had that first night, though time had weathered the logs, and there were new touches everywhere from their summers here. Clara could almost see her younger self standing in this doorway, dripping wet and frightened, could almost see Jonas young and angry and alone. She was grateful to those younger versions of themselves for being brave enough to reach for love when it would have been easier to turn away. That night, they made love in the bed where they had spent their wedding night, where Thomas had been born, where so many important moments of their marriage had unfolded. Jonas was gentle and thorough, still knowing exactly how to make Clara tremble and sigh after 25 years. Afterward, Clara traced the scars on his chest, souvenirs from the war and from decades of hard mountain living, and Jonas caught her hand and kissed her palm. "You saved me," Jonas signed when Clara looked at him. "Was drowning in the past, in guilt, in loneliness. You pulled me back to life." Clara signed back, "We saved each other. I was lost too. We found our way together." Jonas nodded and pulled her close, and they fell asleep wrapped around each other the way they had every night for 25 years. They returned to town the next week to find that Rose was pregnant again, and Thomas had decided to run for town council, and Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, had decided to finally retire and wanted to sell Clara the boarding house. Life continued its forward march, and Jonas and Clara marched with it, hand in hand. On Clara's 50th birthday, Jonas baked her another cake, this one even more elaborate than the first, 3 layers with buttercream frosting and candied violets on top. The whole family gathered to celebrate, children and grandchildren crowding the cabin, and Clara looked around at all the people she and Jonas had created together, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thomas gave a speech in sign language, thanking his mother for teaching him that communication was about heart, not ears, and Rose presented Clara with a quilt she had sewn, each square representing a year of Clara's life. But it was Jonas's gift that made Clara cry. He presented her with a wooden box, carved like the first one he had given her but larger and more intricate, every surface covered with scenes from their life together. There was the cabin in the storm, Jonas and Clara walking in the mountains, their wedding, Thomas as a baby, Rose learning to walk, family dinners, moments big and small all preserved in wood. Clara ran her fingers over the carvings and knew Jonas had spent months on this, maybe years, working in his shop when she thought he was just making toys for the grandchildren. "This is our story," Jonas signed when Clara looked at him. "Wanted you to have something physical to hold. Something that says this all really happened. We really built this beautiful life." Clara could not stop crying as she held the box and looked at her husband, this man who had once been so broken and angry, who had learned to love and be loved, who had given her everything. That night when the family had gone home and the cabin was quiet again, Jonas and Clara sat on the porch and watched the stars wheel overhead. Jonas signed, "Do you think we will have more years? More time?" Clara signed back, "I hope so. But if not, I am grateful for every moment we had." Jonas nodded and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that was full rather than empty, the kind of silence that came from two people who knew each other so completely that words, spoken or signed, were sometimes unnecessary. They were blessed with more years, many of them. They saw grandchildren graduate from school and start families of their own. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by 3 generations of Blackwoods. Jonas's hair went completely silver, and his hands developed arthritis that made signing more difficult. But his storm cloud eyes never lost their intensity when they looked at Clara. Clara's hair turned white as snow, and her fingers could no longer manage the finest needlework. But she still ran her shop with help from Rose's daughter, who had inherited her grandmother's talent with fabric and thread. When Jonas was 75 and Clara 73, they returned one last time to the cabin on Blackwood Peak. They had not been back in several years, their aging bodies no longer able to manage the rough mountain roads, but Jonas insisted. Thomas drove them up in his wagon, and he helped his father walk the last 100 yards to the cabin that had stood empty but maintained, waiting for them. Clara and Jonas spent a week there alone together, moving slowly and sleeping often but savoring every moment. They sat on the porch and watched the aspens turn gold with autumn, and Jonas signed to Clara about the first time he had seen her, how angry he had been that his solitude was interrupted, how little he had known that his real life was about to begin. Clara signed back about how frightened she had been, how close she had come to not knocking on the door at all, how grateful she was that she had been brave enough to ask for help. On their last night, Jonas baked Clara one final cake, his hands shaking with effort but determined. It was a simple cake, nothing fancy, but when Clara tasted it she thought it was the sweetest thing she had ever eaten. Jonas had written on top in frosting, "Love you forever," and Clara cried as she cut slices for them both. They sat by the fire and ate cake and held hands, and Jonas signed, "Was worth it. All of it. Every hard thing was worth it to have you." Clara signed back, "Best decision I ever made was knocking on your door in the storm." Jonas smiled and pulled her close, and they sat together watching the flames until the fire burned low. When Thomas came to collect them the next morning, he found them asleep in each other's arms in the big bed, peaceful and content. Jonas woke first and signed to his son, "Ready to go home now." Thomas helped them to the wagon and they rode slowly down the mountain, Jonas and Clara sitting close on the seat, looking back at the cabin until it disappeared among the trees. They had several more good years in town, surrounded by family and friends. Jonas became something of a legend, the hermit who had loved so fiercely he came down from his mountain, and young people would seek him out for advice about love and life. Jonas always told them the same thing: love is not easy, love is not soft. Love is choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. Love is sacrifice and compromise and putting someone else's needs alongside your own. Love is worth every hard moment. Clara continued working in her shop until she was 80, training her granddaughter to take over the business that had started with $40 and a prayer. She loved watching the next generation of women create beauty with needle and thread, loved knowing that something of herself would continue after she was gone. Jonas died first, on a spring morning when the columbines were blooming in the meadows. He went peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him, her hand in his, and his last signs to her the night before had been, "Love you. Thank you for my life." Clara grieved deeply but without regret, grateful for 55 years of marriage to a man who had loved her with everything he had. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them carrying pieces of Jonas and Clara forward into the future. She spent her last summer at the cabin on Blackwood Peak, Thomas carrying her up in his wagon because she could no longer walk the distance. She sat on the porch and remembered everything, every moment of the life she had built with Jonas, and she felt his presence there so strongly it was as if he stood beside her. Clara died on an autumn evening with leaves falling like gold coins around the cabin, Rose holding one hand and Thomas holding the other. Her last thought was of Jonas waiting for her, of his storm cloud eyes and his gentle hands and his fierce protective love. She had started her journey as a frightened deaf woman running from a man who thought he owned her, and she ended it surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was. She had been Clara Whitmore who became Clara Blackwood, and in the end she had been simply Clara, beloved and complete. They buried her beside Jonas on the hill above Pine Ridge, under a massive pine tree with a view of the mountains. The whole town came to the funeral, and people told stories about the deaf seamstress who had tamed the hermit of Blackwood Peak, who had built a business and a family and a legacy of love. On the gravestone Thomas had carved the words Jonas had written on that first cake, "Love you forever," and beneath it, Clara and Jonas Blackwood, married 1878, reunited 1933, never truly apart. The cabin on Blackwood Peak remained in the family, passed down through generations, and became a place where Blackwood descendants would go to remember the love story that had started it all. The story of how a deaf woman knocked on a door in a storm and an angry, broken man answered, how he had growled at her not to cry, and how he had eventually baked her a beautiful sweet cake, and how that simple act of tenderness had been the beginning of everything. The story of how two lonely people had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and family, and the courage to stay when it would have been easier to leave. The story of Clara and Jonas Blackwood, mountain man and deaf bride, who had loved each other so fiercely that even death could not diminish it, who had proven that the best love stories are not the easy ones but the ones that are fought for and earned and treasured every single day.